sure to keep any comments in the chat polite, and I have the power to boot you if you say anything inflammatory or inappropriate, but I don't expect that of anybody. So just be kind, and but also please do use the chat and the Q&A function to ask any questions, because Hadeer and Shannon, once they are finished with their own conversation, we'll be opening it up to audience questions after the fact. And in addition, we are, as you might know, the HarperCollins union strike is continuing still 2 months in, and we are pledging 10% of sales from Hadeer's book today to their strike fund. So thank you so much for tuning in, for reading, for supporting authors, Harper authors, and all writers. And now we really get started. So Hadeer Elsbai is an Egyptian-American writer and librarian. Born in New York City, she grew up being shuffled between Queens and Cairo. Hadeer studied history at Hunter College and later earned her master's degree in library science from Queens College, making her a CUNY alum twice over. She has published short stories in The Dark and Anathema. The Daughters of Izdihar is her first novel. And she is being interviewed tonight by Shannon Chakraborty, who is the author of the critically acclaimed and internationally best-selling Daevabad trilogy. Her work has been translated into over a dozen languages and nominated for the Hugo, Locus, World Fantasy, Crawford, and Astounding Awards. Her next book, The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi, is forthcoming in March of 2023. And now I will turn it over to your wonderful authors.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. I was delighted to be asked to interview you, Hadeer, because I loved your book. I was in such a reading slump when they sent me the arc, and it was just like this glorious, like I couldn't put it down. It just like kept going and kept going. I got sorry.
No worries.
I couldn't put it down. It just, the character growth, which is something I'm always looking for in books, was just amazing, but also dangerous because you love them so much and you're just like, stop doing all of these things, be safe. So I adored it. I just got out of the way. But I want to start, just since this is the first book in the series, kind of what inspired you to write it? How would you pitch it to all of these new lovely people joining us tonight?
Yeah. Okay. So basically, I worked hard to come up with like a kind of log line, which is Sapphic suffragettes use elements of magic to fight the patriarchy in an Egyptian-inspired fantasy world, which is probably really long for a log line, but it's what I've got so far. So yeah, it's set in an Egyptian-inspired fantasy world. It's about two very different women. They come from different means. They have completely different personalities. So we've got Nehal, who is this very like bold and headstrong aristocrat. And then you've got Giorgina, who is a bookseller. She is very poor. She's very reserved. She's really just trying her best to survive, live her life. They're both weavers, so Nehal can control the element of water. Giorgina can control the element of earth. But while Nehal is very eager and excited to learn how to use her element, Giorgina is sort of like more just frightened of her powers. They come together because Nehal is set up to be married to Nico, the man who Giorgina is in love with. But they also come together because they both are part of the Daughters of Izdihar, which is a radical women's rights group that is fighting to win the vote for women. And while all of this interpersonal drama is going on, and then the activism as well, there's this threat of war looming in the background from a neighboring nation who isn't particularly keen on weavers. And so the inspiration for this, so it was like it came from a whole bunch of disparate things. The main inspiration is just Egyptian history. So a big part of the plot is based on the suffrage movement, the women's suffrage movement in Egypt in the 1950s. So there's a woman named Doreya Shafi, and she sort of led this movement. And the character of Malak Mamdouh, who leads the Daughters of Izdihar in the novel, is heavily based on this woman. I actually read like whole dissertation on Doreya Shafi just to get like a lot of like little details, to get like certain quotes, certain things she said that I had Malak say. So it was really, really fun to put her in my book in that way. And I really just wanted to capture the spirit of 19th century Egypt. So I read a lot about the 19th century, about like Europeans who visited the 19th century, their descriptions of it, to try and put all of those details in there. Because I find that you don't tend to see a lot about like modern Egypt or the 19th century. You see a lot of ancient Egypt, which is like fine. I probably don't know as much about ancient Egypt as I should. It's never really interested in that much, but I really like the 19th century in general. And I think Egypt during the 19th century was, like a lot of other countries, just going through a lot of changes, opening up in different ways. And I really just wanted to incorporate that. And then the other two influences, if you're not familiar with them, you probably won't have any idea what they have to do with the book, because it's just vibes basically. So I read The Beautiful Ones by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, which is one of my favorite books, and I read that book and I kind of wanted to capture like the fantasy of manners vibe almost. The language and just like all the interpersonal relationships. And so I read that book and I wrote like the first 10,000 words of Daughters of Izdihar, and those have remained mostly unchanged actually. And then another inspiration is a musical actually called Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, which is based on War and Peace, and that's also just vibes. And then, of course, there's Avatar: The Last Airbender as well. Love that show, and like the inspiration is clear in the elemental magic. So yeah, so lots of different sources of inspiration that don't seem to mesh very well together. Yeah.
No, I love that. I'm actually going to skip then to my question about writing a secondary world that was so heavily inspired by Egypt, because I adored it. It felt like a love letter. Like you had just the multicultural seascape of sort of Alexandria had such a different well, not they're all named differently in the book, but like, versus you could feel the weight of like Cairo and like the academies. I can't speak English tonight. The religious institutions. So I loved that, even from the cafes and it was obviously like the Kana Kalili. It was, I loved it. It's interesting what you're saying about the 20th century vibe, because that does come across. There is so much of that, like leap into a new world and all the just chaos that accompanied that, because that's women were told, like, we'll get to your rights. Let's just fix things first. We're always like, you'll be fine. Sit out to the side. But I am kind of curious to hear how you went about writing something that was technically secondary world, but so obviously like a mirror of the real world.
Yeah. So I started writing this during a period when I was kind of like falling back in love with Egypt. For a long time, I was not. And so I started like reading a lot of stuff from the period, and just sort of learning more about this history that I'd never really known about before. Because like I said, like, about ancient Egypt, and then it's like Egyptian history just stops. So I didn't know all of this like fascinating stuff. And then at the same time, I was also just like getting back in touch with the country, like going back for more visits, visiting various like historical places in the country. And I wanted to incorporate all of that. I wanted to put all of that on the page. So I very deliberately like took a lot of details, whether from the historical things I read, or whether from my own visits, and plopped them in there. There's a lot of Easter eggs for Egyptian readers. There's a lot of like probably like dumb stuff that I did too, like even on the map. So some of those place names are real, but like they're in entirely different locations than they would be in real life, because I just wanted to be dumb and just play around with that, so that Egyptian readers could read it and laugh. um, yeah, and I wanted to just bring all of that together, like mesh things together, like the religion, for example. Like I wanted to, incorporate something that felt like a compilation of all the Abrahamic faiths as well as the ancient Egyptian religion. So just bring in that like fantasy vibe while at the same time trying to incorporate something that was actually reminiscent of Egypt.
I like it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And then I guess kind of getting back on that, just about fantasy. Like, tell me about your relationship with fantasy growing up. Have you always liked it? Do you have any childhood faves? I know you did write short stories before this. You wrote a very terrifying one for the dark, like years ago, that I remember being like, she's going places.
Oh.
And you are, now you're here. So talk to us a bit about your sort of history with fantasy and writing.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been genre for me. Fantasy and also horror, as you just said. I really love horror. But yeah, fantasy for sure. I mean, growing up, I definitely read a lot of like R.L. Stine, Goosebumps, Fear Street, that kind of stuff. I read a lot of Christopher Pike, who's not as well known as R.L. Stine, but he wrote like very weird books. Read a lot of Anne Rice. I think the first high fantasy I read was Hawksong by Amelia Edgewater Rhodes, which was about like these two warring nations of people who could transform into animals. And the two leaders of the nations had to come together into an arranged marriage to broker a peace. So maybe that's where I get my arranged marriage.
Spirit alive.
And then I think in high school I read Arian by Maggie Fury, which is like very like classic fantasy, like elemental magic, dragons, mages, that type of thing. And then in high school I read A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, and I was really obsessed to this day. I'm still incredibly obsessed with that series, and it's still like a constant inspiration. And then later in college I read N.K. Jemisin's The Inheritance trilogy, which she always does like different things with fantasy, and that like her work was really interesting, and it sort of inspired me to write things in like a different way, different from like the old guard and the classics and whatnot. And then my journey to publication, I guess, was actually pretty straightforward, which I'm grateful for. I wrote the novel, like queried, and it all went pretty well. And I mean, The Daughters of Izdihar is actually like the first novel I've completed. I've always struggled to finish. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I always struggle to finish things. Just struggle with endings. So I wrote before, but never completed something and polished it up. So yeah, it was nice to finally do that and then submit that, and it all went smoothly, I think. So
that's great. It's interesting. You're like the fourth person, and I had the same experience with Jemisin's Inheritance Cycle. That I read it in I think college, maybe like right after I graduated, and I had come to fantasy a little late, and I just remember reading it and being like, wait, we're allowed to do this? Like we can kind of play with these elements and these tropes, and it really sparked my own writing and everything. Which is amazing.
Her duology too is incredible. That one is inspired by ancient Egypt.
Yes.
Dreamblood duology. That's a really
good. But on that, I just forgot my next question. So it was a question that was related to what you said, and this is why people don't let me interview. But I'll move on to something I really wanted to ask, which is, I think in fantasy nowadays, we see a lot of great discussions about how sort of the terrible norms in our world are either replicated in secondary world or not. Homophobia, sexism, the patriarchy. And I think there's been a great move towards getting rid of that and essentially being like, if we're imagining entirely new worlds, why are we carrying over some of the terrible things in ours? And I enjoy the escapism that I enjoy seeing different worlds and fantasies realized. But when I read your book, because it does not do that, it very much replicates and mirrors the patriarchy. And I just really appreciated it because I don't think I had really read a modern fantasy that held it up in its it's duplicity and it's manipulation and it's violence in a way that, quite frankly, probably affects all of our societies. Still, we like to say it's, oh, you know, it's in the past, or oh, my country whatever is better, and then you're like, you look up domestic violence rates, and and I liked it, and I liked that it let you be angry. I read it, quite frankly, when Roe versus Wade was overturned, and I was enraged, and it just really, it let its characters be angry. It felt like it let the reader be angry, and you know, you kind of just really showed like the complication and the mess of how it works with when your family's telling you, you know, don't dishonor us, don't disrespect us. When your politicians are saying, listen, we have the problems of the nation come before women's issues. So I just kind of want to talk, like, you know, talk me through like some of the decisions you made about showing it and portraying it and really wrestling with the elements of that in the novel.
Yeah. So I think I do agree with what you said, that like, you know, gender norm fantasies that have become more popular, they're great escapism. And they're a nice like relief. It's nice to escape into a world that's like free of all of that. But personally, I've always been drawn more to fantasy that incorporates patriarchy and gender injustice. Um, I maybe it's just that I don't find like utopias of that sort as interesting. I like reading and writing about the struggles that we are familiar with in our world and the struggles that we come up against all the time. And it was really cathartic to write about that, to write about the patriarchy in that way, and you know, things that I've personally seen and experienced, and to have someone like Nehal go up against it with such fire, you know, like do certain things that I couldn't do, right? It's so funny to see like some reviewers be like, oh, this sexism is so heavy-handed, and I'm like, there's some pulled word for word from people I have spoken to in real life. Like I could have been more heavy-handed. So yeah, I think like, you know, like you said too, like these are things that we're still struggling with now in whichever country. And I think sometimes people like forget that, or try to forget that. So I think it's, you know, I like to sort of put it at the forefront, and have us just think about it. um, yeah.
And it did. It felt incredible. It felt like it was the first time I had seen a lot of things. And this is, I won't spoil it too much, but this was probably the first and most realistic just depiction of abortion and sort of the consequences of that I have ever read in fantasy. It, you know, it dealt with, again, just the way people spoke to each other, and were, you know, men would talk over you, and there was elements sometimes of belittling, and about at the same time that, you know, I love Nahal because the fire is great. But at the same time, you did not shy away from the consequences. And I just think there was a realness to it. I just don't really feel like I've read in a lot of books.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that.
And then kind of on that, because I have to talk about the characters. I loved the characters. They were so real and they were so messy. And I think that's a term we like to talk about, like, oh, I like my complicated female characters, and you know, morally great. Like we throw these words around. But there was just a realness to it. And I think you kind of like, you touched on all the things, like we say the arranged marriage trope, and then you kind of just tore it apart. And you know, it really was like, well, how would this work? You know, like in all of the nuance and complication of that, or letting them, you know, Nahabi be a Spitfire, Georgina be not that, but and then the very real consequences. So I have to ask, like, how did you go about putting together these characters?
So this is probably like, part of this is going to be a little bit of a cop-out answer, because usually with characters, they just sort of come to me like very fully formed. Especially the main three, I would say. So Nico, Nehal, and Georgina, they sort of just like emerged. And I will say though that because the inspiration was The Beautiful Ones by Silva Marina Garcia, and that was a novel that was so heavily focused on like the interpersonal, I wanted to make sure that I had characters who did feel very real, because they came before the plot. You know, like when this novel was first envisioned, actually, there wasn't so much an element of like fighting for women's rights. It was really just going to be focused on that arranged marriage, and it was just going to be the three of them dealing with that. And so because I was so like wanting to focus on that, I really just tried to delve into like these characters' inner selves as much as I could. I also will say that with Nehal and Giorgina, I tried to work a little with their weaving and have it mirror their personalities in like non-traditional ways. So like Nehal is often called a fiery character, but she's not a fire weaver, right? She's a water weaver, and that is because I personally find the ocean terrifying. Ever since I was a kid, like my parents tried to put me in swimming lessons, and I would cry and scream and run away from the water. But yeah, just like the force of a tsunami, or like those pictures of lighthouses being hit by gigantic, powerful waves. Like the ocean is a force to be reckoned with.
It is.
Yeah, so I thought of that, how that maps onto Nihal's personality, and then with Georgina, she is an earthweaver, and I think earth can often be associated with like great strength and stolidity, and I mean you can see definitely resilience in Georgina, which I think like earth can be resilient, it can be malleable, can even be exploited, right? Which I think fits very well with Georgina's narrative. And then yeah, for like all the interpersonal stuff, I really love the arranged marriage trope. Like you were saying, just like breaking it down into like how does this actually work? Like these two people who are just in forced proximity, they're forced to be together. They just like they were strangers the day before, and now suddenly they're married, right? Like how do they deal with each other? How do they talk to each other? How do they feel about that? So that was really fun to do. I think that writing Nehel and Nico's interactions was one of my favorite parts to write, because they're so different, but they're just stuck together. So it was really fun to see how they sort of like clashed against one another.
Well, I like that because I think there was a point in the book when I was kind of just like, I ship everyone with everyone. I don't know how I feel. Even like the romance, like the way you did the romance and the relationships felt to me like very unconventional. Like you kind of think it's going one way, and then maybe it's going another way, and now you're not sure. And then, like I said, halfway through, you're like, everybody gets together. But so, like, how kind of did you? Because I'm very curious to say what you're saying about the comedy of manners, because now, thinking back on it, I can pick up on that. I think it's great because then a good comedy of manners, of course, that always brings in the family, and then that messes things up even more. So how did you kind of think about writing the romance, writing their sort of family relationships and obligations? That's always part of it.
Yeah, so I think one thing that you said that I wanted to touch on again is like just that incorporation of family too. So like a lot of fantasy with characters these ages like maybe might not include parents or something like that, but I very much want to stick to like traditional Egyptian culture where like the parents are going to be involved in your life whether you like it or not. And no matter how hard you try to get away, like in the book you can see like Nihal's parents are just always on her case even after she's married, and she's like, I'm married now, like I can make my own decisions, and they're like, nope, no you cannot. And Georgina's family similarly imposes all these obligations on her, and she has all these responsibilities to them, so I definitely wanted to make sure to sort of incorporate that even with Nico, like his father is the one that makes him marry Georgina and just changes his life in such a significant way. Yeah, and then just for the romance, like you said, I like very deliberately wanted to go in a non-traditional direction. I wanted to subvert like this arranged marriage trope, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it is nice. I do like the trope where like, arranged marriage and they end up falling in love. I do like that. But I just wanted to not do that. I wanted to do something different, to see, what the consequences would be if it was done a little bit differently. And Nehel is such a non-traditional person, for her to have a non-traditional relationship, or what's considered non-traditional in her society, and for her to deal with that, and for her to have to struggle like with keeping that secret. She's someone who's so bold and she thinks she can do whatever she wants, and to have to struggle with this secret and be aware of the consequences. Like this is one of the few things in the book where she's very aware of the dangers of revealing her relationship with Malak. So
And I liked that. I thought it was a very good craft thing that you see how open she is with everything else, and then when it comes to that, it's like a door slamming shut. And it was just, it really, when I was reading, I was like, it was a stark thing that it made you very aware this was different.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think that was great. Like I said, I was just reading and like it was ticking all my boxes. I was like, yes, female women, like female characters are allowed to have complicated romance, or like they're surrounded by all these messed up family members and friends. Good. So yeah, so actually kind of going back to the weaving, because I loved the magic system. I am also an Avatar fan, so I'm like happy to see it anywhere, any influences that show up. But I liked it. I also liked that it's dangerous. I mean, you don't shy away from the fact that as much as we are cheering for these characters to come into their magic and show their powers, it's a very dangerous system. The fact that not everyone has access to it, of course, gets into issues of power and agency. So I'm very curious to kind of see like how you went about thinking about the magic system, particularly in issues of like, this could come down and explode a giant building.
I like very deliberately wanted to play around with that trope of like, the magic users are oppressed, because you see that a lot. But like, I mean, when you think about it, it's like, well, I mean, people are right to be afraid in some ways. I think of like the Legend of Korra this season. Don't even remember his name, but when people were making it a point that they were afraid of the benders, and it's like, of course they are, like that absolutely makes sense. And so I tried to work with that to make it clear that like, like it's not the fault of the weavers that they can do this, but at the same time they do need that practice and control to be able to manage it so that they don't hurt anyone, because they can, right? And that's what people are worried about, and that's also valid, right? So I tried my best to sort of subvert that idea of like, magic users are oppressed. And I also like one other thing that I think is interesting just in reading like some reviews is that a lot of folks think that only women are weavers, which I thought was really interesting because that's not the case.
There's a whole co-ed school.
Yeah. I don't know. And a lot of like reviews, people are like, oh, only women can weave. And I'm like, no, but it's interesting that like you get that, like people get that impression. So I thought, that was fascinating. And then, elemental magic in general, I think is very, so I wanted to play around with it. I want to sort of put my own spin on it. Like, obviously it's a very common magic system in fantasy. Like, I'm not reinventing the wheel. But I did want to include it in this Egyptian inspired setting. And I also want to sort of like emphasize the science of it, which I try to do in the like academy scenes.
And what made you think, because I know that's like a very common, we always have the magical school, but I just liked your take on it a lot, that it almost felt like, it's just something you go to during the day. It was like this regular thing. And if anything, I was like, I wish I could see more of this. So like what went into your take on the magical school?
I mean, honestly, I kind of struggled with it a lot. So I think that's why it like feels a little weird. So like part of it is that all of these people are adults, right? And they have lives, right? So I think it wouldn't have worked as like, the traditional like boarding school where you just go away and you're sequestered there for months on end. And then like, like I wouldn't have been able to have my characters interact as I wanted them to if it had been that way. But also just like it almost feels like a half measure, because even to the government it's a half measure, because they're not sure. They're like, oh, should we reinstitute weaving? Should we fully commit to this? Should we fully fund it? So they're starting out with like, oh, you can only, only men can attend, and only if they agree to join the army after, and then only women who can pay. So they're sort of slowly inching towards that. So that's why it sort of feels like, it's like incomplete, because they're not sure if they want to fully go there yet, because they're worried about tensions with the neighboring nation, who is really not happy to see them reopen this academy.
Yeah, actually, you know what? I wouldn't mind jumping off on that because I did find sort of the outer geopolitics very fascinating.
Mm.
There was a reason those characters named Nico and Giorgina, but I was like, fantasy, Italy, got. But but I thought that was really interesting. It was a delicious spin on history. But I liked that, like, kind of were there different kinds of thoughts about how you want it, because I get the impression that's going to be a much bigger element of the next book.
Yeah.
But I am kind of curious to see how you went into like bringing in those elements for this novel.
I wanted to try at least a little bit. I definitely don't do it like as well as reality. Like Egypt has always been so multicultural. So many different communities live in Egypt. So I wanted to like, try and work that in somehow, right? Nations are not and have never been homogenous. So I wanted to make sure to try and incorporate that. Again, I definitely don't do as good of a job of it as I had wanted to. And, it's not as reflective of real life as I wanted it to be. But sometimes you're limited when you're when you're
I
writing.
got you today.
You can't include everything. But yeah, so I just wanted to sort of include that like dimension, to it, just to give a sense, like you said, of like the broader world. Like this isn't like this isolated nation having its own problems. Like there's all of these other places, and they have a relationship with all of these other countries, and that needed to be incorporated. And even with like the character of Georgina, who does come from like a fantasy Egyptian family, but has an ancestor who is from this other country. So like it's not even something that is that significant to the plot, but it just it's just a fact to sort of add dimension and color to to her life, to the country. Yeah.
So I know this, just jumping off of her, and then I hadn't realized that you had gone to school for library services, and so you made her a bookseller, and now like the like author and reader in me has to be like, you work in a library, like, so like I'm kind of curious to see like how has it been having that background in librarianship and now being an author? I mean, especially in New York, I'm like I should be paying Daevabad royalties to the Queen's Library, like.
I mean, I will say, so I'm not a public librarian. I think
Okay.
public librarians are superheroes, and I am not a superhero. Yeah, I started as an academic librarian, and I still am an academic librarian. But I think you still like, you still get that like inside look as to, like you get a sense of, publishing in a different way, and book distribution. You get a sense of that in a different way. Yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question.
No, I just like knowing, fine. And then I guess it's sort of jumping off, like what are you working on now? Or is it the sequel? Is it sort of like how has that jump, if it is the sequel, how has that jump to, especially I was in the same position where the first book I ever wrote and completed was the first book I published.
Oh, yeah.
And when you were saying that, I'm just I'm like, oh no, it's gonna be great. It's gonna be great. It's not stressful at all. But sort of
Mhm.
how is that? What are you working on now, and how's that kind of
Yeah,
going?
so it is the sequel. It has consumed my entire being. It's all I can do or think about, as I struggle to finish it. It's getting there.
Yeah.
It's definitely been difficult just because, like, like they say second books are difficult, and for a variety of reasons. I think for me, one of the main reasons is just because, like, I wrote Daughters of Izdihar back in like 2018, right? And now it's 2023, and like my tastes have changed, my writing style has changed, the way I, interpret these characters has changed. So it's been a weird struggle trying to like adapt to my new style now, and also trying to remain true to the first book, because I don't want to give readers like something totally different and they're like, what is this is like not what we signed up for. But at the same time, it feels like it just feels strange trying to sort of mimic like a style that I've kind of left behind. So I think that's been causing kind of a dissonance, and that's why it's been a little bit of a struggle. And then also just like, writing on deadline is, as they say, it's not fun. I don't like it.
No, it's a big adjustment where you're like, what do you mean? I can work on this whenever I want. And no, I feel you. I rewrote my entire second book, and then my third book entered entirely different. So
Yeah.
I feel you on kind of where as a creator do you follow the original path, or you kind of go the way you're
Mhm.
sort of writing and creative it is saying go do this.
Mhm. Yeah, and plus it's just been like so long with these characters now. And I mean, you know that. Like you've spent so long with your character trilogy. So it's like at some point, like you'd love them, but like it's like I'm ready to move on to something new.
Yeah. Do you think you'll kind of like go back to horror elements or?
I think so. I feel like if I ever wrote a horror, it would maybe be like a novella rather than a novel. I feel like it's really hard to carry horror through a
Yeah.
whole novel. I feel like there are authors who do it really well, and I don't think I have that skill. High fantasy or fantasy in general is more my bread and butter, I think. So the another book that I actually wrote when I was querying Daughters is a historical fantasy.
Oh,
And that's one that I would like to, like to get into as soon as I am done with this sequel. I can have my life back.
that was what I did. I was working on the historical fantasy that would become the Adventures of Mina Sarafi while querying, and just don't do what I did and be like, I'm gonna go completely historically accurate because it will kill you.
The research, oh my
Oh
goodness.
yeah. But that's awesome. And then I just wanted to ask, I know we're going to be moving into audience questions soon, but I have to ask this question because I get asked this question a lot. And
Okay.
now I get to flip it on another author, which is when you write characters you love and you write them so realistically that you know your readers are going to fall for them, how do you do terrible things to them and take away their dreams? How does that feel?
I struggle. I'm not good at it. I'm not good at it. Yeah, I really have to force myself. I'm actually really bad at making terrible things happen to my characters. It's not good. It's not good for the plot because I just want them to be happy and just live happy lives. So yeah, I struggle. Help me out, if a friend reads it and they're like, you gotta do this, you make this person suffer, and I'm like, you're right. That helps to have that outside perspective because to be happy all the time.
No, then there wouldn't technically be a plot. But it's funny because I think there's always like that feeling that we're like cackling, and I'm just like, no, it's quite hard.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's hard.
But yes, I see our lovely host back.
Yes, hello. I'm like giggling and delighted to watch this conversation happen. But I do want to make sure that we have a little time for questions from the audience. There has been in the chat. There is a lot of love for Natasha Pierre and the great comment in the chat, and a lot of love for librarians. Everybody watching, please do enter anything you want to know into the Q&A or just write into the chat. I'm going to start with a question of mine. Hadeer and Shannon, both, which element would you want to be able to weave?
Oh.
I've always been, so weirdly enough, even though I just said I'm terrified of the water, I've always wanted to weave water. I just think it's so versatile. And it just looks really cool. So
No, I agree. I grew up along the coast, and something sort of the idea of water and societies and the link of that and how like places grow up alongside either oceans or rivers has been something that's always fascinated me. So I think there's a lot of power behind that. And there's just all sorts of interesting creatures associated with it as well.
Yeah, I'm a Scorpio. I'm a water sign, and I also grew up spending summers at the ocean, so I'm definitely on Team Water Weaver. Well, we have a question from Rohit. What is your favorite episode of Avatar, if you have one?
it is probably, I think it's called The Drill. It's the episode with the drill, when the drill is going into Ba Sing Se and Aang, goes down the wall and hits the drill and stops the drill from shattering the wall. That is peak.
Okay, next question. Which of your characters would you want to sit down to dinner with, and what would you talk about?
Let's see. I so probably Nico, just because he is such a nerd and knows. Yeah, I love nerds, I'm a nerd myself. He just knows so much about so much. We could probably have a very, very rich conversation, I think.
I feel like I'm just going to be piggybacking off your answers because my answer for mine would be Ali. It's the same thing. I'm like, he knows a lot. Like, I can tell him about the human world. Like, that would be a fascinating conversation to have. All four of us will get together.
It's a great dinner party. Are there any 2023 releases you're especially looking forward to reading? Aside from Shannon's new book, of course.
Yeah, of course. And then I'll recommend, well, not recommend because I haven't read them, but like I'm really looking forward to them. So they are both Arab inspired. So one is Spice Road by Maya Ibrahim, and then the other one is Egyptian inspired, The Jasad Air by Sarah Heshem. So I'm really, really looking forward to those.
I'm gonna have to look both of those up and make sure that they are not just on my radar, but on my pending orders.
I feel like I'm slightly cheating because the one really good thing that you don't know, at least I didn't know about being an author before I was there, is you get advanced copies of books. just fabulous. So a couple of the would have been my most anticipated, but that are coming out soon. One is God Killer by Hannah Kanner, which I think comes out. Yeah, you know what? It was pitched to me as like, sort of like a female inspired Witcher, but it was great. It had a wonderful cast of characters and sort of this found family that it wasn't a grim setting. I wasn't ready to read grim stuff lately, but that had sort of this warm camaraderie, and it had a really interesting take on religion and fantasy, which is a topic I can talk about all the time. And I really felt like it showed how deeply faith can kind of scar and also inspire. And it was just really interesting. Fonda Lee, who is an auto-buy author for me, has a novella coming out, The Untethered Sky, which is like this very like Central Asian inspired horse. Well, I guess I can't say horse culture because they're Aruk culture, like these giant hawk birds that fly through the sky. And I really liked that. It was just like a snappy read. There's just so much. I know another auto-buy author for me is Roshni Chakshi, and she has The Flower Bride coming out, which is just great. Like her prose is just delicious, and it was just like such a messed up grown up version on a fairy tale. But I honestly, like, I think this is going to be a great year for books. Like, even just, it's January 10th, and I was already like, I need to go to the store because I want this one and this one and this one, even though I already have this one and this one and this one, and I've already read this one and this one and this one. So
my if I can interject as bookseller, my most anticipated 2023 read, Emily Wilson, who translated the Odyssey recently, was the first woman to translate the Odyssey for publication. Her translation of the Iliad is scheduled to come out in September.
I didn't know that.
I can't wait for that. I keep checking to see with my rep to see, like, do you have a copy of this that you can send me yet? Please put me on the list.
All the kids who speak Latin, like, yes.
I'm such a Latin nerd. My Latin teacher was the best. Which characters in your worlds would get along with each other the best?
So like in both of our worlds, like.
Oh, I guess you can interpret that. Maybe a little cross pollination. Yeah.
I think Ali and Nico would get along. And I think Nahar and Nehal would get along.
Yes, I agree. It
would cause chaos. It would be very dangerous for everybody. But yeah, that.
Yeah, I agree.
Did you base any of your characters off of people you know in real life? Or you don't have to admit to that if you don't.
Not entirely. I think a couple of characters served as like jumping off points, I will say. But I'm not going to say who.
Yeah, that's a dangerous question. I feel like I always take elements. I think I write more elements of myself into my characters and don't really realize it until like an interview, or we'll bring it up in public, and I'll have to like act like I'm not having like a moment where I'm like, oh wow, I guess I do have issues with that. But yeah, not direct people. Weirdly enough, I know like people always ask that. I haven't felt that urge. I think like you can see elements of how like in general humans behave and take from that, but I haven't written like an actual person into my books.
I feel like it's actually hard. Like it's so much harder to take a whole person and distill them than to come up with your own.
I guess when you're writing fantasy, you have the advantage that like you can bring in these other, like they have this magical element so that it's not quite so much just both in the person and the world, that you're not, I feel like I read a lot of contemporary realistic fiction where it's like, oh, this is someone's cousin, or
contemporary is dangerous.
Well, what's the worst is then when like the people in your life read it and think they're in it. Like,
there's a whole, Miley Malloy wrote a book called Liars and Saints that then has a follow-up book that isn't exactly a sequel, but the premise of the follow-up is that Liars and Saints was written by one of the characters in whatever, something daughter. And her family is furious at her because they're all like, how dare you tell our family secrets that way? I'm not a lesbian. This didn't happen that way. And like, she's like, this is fiction. And it becomes this whole like meta narrative examining that. And it's so
wow.
Okay, follow-up question about your crossover characters. Which non-antagonists would get along the worst in a crossover of your two worlds?
Antagonists.
I don't know. I mean, I won't answer the question live about whether or not Dara is an antagonist in my book. But he doesn't really get along with anyone, so he's a free pick.
Yeah, because he was going to be my answer, but then they said non-antagonist, so I don't know.
I mean, I would call him an antagonist, but well, no, it's been a few years. I'll call him an antagonist now. So yeah, I mean, you have a lot of humans in your book, and a lot of he doesn't get along with anyone.
Yeah, that is all the official questions that we've received. I think unless you've got any last wisdom or like gripes or like cat photos or yeah, I'm gonna say thank you to both of you. This has been an absolutely delightful way to spend an hour. I hope everybody who's watching gets a chance to read Daughters of Izdihar, which is really fantastic. And like I said, if you have not yet ordered a copy, you can order a signed copy through the Astoria Bookshop, and we are pledging 10% of the sales to the HarperCollins Union Strike Fund. And if you tuned in late, or if you want to share this with somebody, it will be available on our YouTube channel after the fact. So that is all. Thank you to everyone, especially thank you, Hadeer and Shannon, for giving us your time tonight. And I will say good night to everyone.
Yes. Thank you for everyone for coming, and Hadeer for writing this wonderful book. You should all go buy it. You'll enjoy it. It will capture you, and you won't be able to put it down. And then you'll also be like, "But you should work up right to that sequel now. No pressure."
All right.
Yeah.